Get me the real menu. What is all this rubbish? Or you don't understand English?
Ben Qualls woke up every morning believing he was untouchable, the kind of man who wore confidence like a second skin, who moved through marble hallways with the certainty of someone who thought the world bent to his will. And why wouldn't he? Everything around him screamed success. The estate stretched across 12 manicured acres, its contemporary architecture gleaming white against the Virginia sky. Inside, Italian marble floors caught the morning light, reflecting it back like scattered diamonds. Original art lined the walls, pieces most people only saw in museums. The garage housed a collection of luxury vehicles that could fund a small country's healthcare system. Ben walked past it all every single day, chest out, believing every inch of it proved his worth. But here's the thing about illusions. They're only real until someone turns on the lights. This particular morning started like any other. Ben stood before his walk-in closet, a room larger than most people's bedrooms, selecting a navy Tom Ford suit. His fingers moved with practiced ease, choosing a silk tie that cost more than the monthly salary of the staff downstairs. The Patek Philippe watch clicked into place on his wrist, a subtle flex he'd perfected over years of important meetings and charity galas. He studied himself in the full-length mirror, adjusting his collar with the kind of precision that suggested he'd been performing this ritual his entire life. The reflection staring back looked every bit the self-made success story he told at dinner parties. Except Ben Qualls hadn't made anything. He'd just been very good at acting like he had. Downstairs, the kitchen staff moved with choreographed efficiency, preparing his breakfast exactly how he demanded it. French press coffee, 2 eggs over easy, whole-grain toast, lightly buttered. Ben strode in, phone already pressed to his ear, talking loudly about quarterly projections to someone who probably wasn't even listening. He snapped his fingers at Maria, the housekeeper, pointing toward his briefcase without breaking his conversation. She retrieved it silently, placing it beside his chair with the kind of careful deference that comes from years of reading a room's temperature. "Get Jenkins on the line." Ben barked to no one in particular, assuming someone would make it happen. Someone always did. "Tell him the Anderson deal needs my signature by noon. My signature, not anyone else's." His signature. That's what he said. But let me break it down for you. Every document Ben Qualls signed had already been approved by someone else. Every contract, every agreement, every check that left the Qualls Holdings account bore his name only after it had been authorized by the person who actually held the power. Ben just didn't know it yet. The morning continued its predictable rhythm. Ben moved through the estate issuing instructions, making demands, treating the staff like background characters in his personal empire-building narrative. He checked his reflection in every available surface, the hallway mirrors, the glass doors, the polished chrome of the espresso machine. Each time, he liked what he saw: success, power, control, the holy trinity of a man who confused ownership with identity. Around 10 o'clock, as Ben prepared for another day of pretending to run a company that ran itself, something shifted in the household's usual rhythm. There was movement outside, the sound of tires on gravel, a car door closing with that specific, weighted thunk that luxury vehicles make. Ben glanced toward the window, half interested, expecting a delivery or perhaps the landscaping crew arriving early. Instead, he saw her. Donna A. Qualls descended the front steps with the kind of grace that couldn't be taught or bought. She wore a gold satin dress that caught the morning sun, her dark skin luminous against the fabric's shimmer. Everything about her presence commanded attention without demanding it. The way she moved, the set of her shoulders, the calm certainty in her eyes. She wasn't performing confidence like Ben did every morning in his mirror. She simply was confident, the way mountains are confident they won't fall. Behind her, a black luxury sedan idled at the circular drive, its engine purring almost inaudibly. And beside it stood a man Ben had never seen before. He was older, maybe late 50s or early 60s, with silver-gray hair precisely cut and styled. He wore a crisp chauffeur's uniform, but something about the way he carried himself suggested the uniform was just costuming. His posture was too assured, his gaze too penetrating for someone whose job was supposedly just to drive and open doors. He held himself like a man who'd seen more than most people ever would, who'd learned patience the hard way and came out the other side sharper for it. Ben watched from the window as Donna approached the man, speaking to him quietly. The man, Tony, Ben would learn later, nodded once, his expression unreadable. Then Donna turned and caught Ben's eyes through the glass. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just looked at him with an expression that made something uncomfortable twist in his stomach. It was the look a teacher gives a student who keeps getting the wrong answer, who refuses to see the obvious truth written on the board. Ben pulled away from the window, laughing to himself. A new driver, that's all this was. Donna had mentioned something about needing more reliable transportation for her foundation work, though Ben hadn't really been listening at the time. He never really listened when she talked about her projects. Why would he? He had important business to handle. That afternoon, Ben found himself in his study, another room filled with expensive furniture and impressive certificates, most of which bore Donna's name if you looked close enough. He was reviewing contracts for a new acquisition, feeling that familiar rush of power that came from moving money around on paper. His assistant had sent over the files, everything neatly organized, waiting for his authoritative signature. Through the window, he could see Tony washing the sedan, moving with methodical precision. The man's movements were almost meditative, each circular motion of the cloth deliberate and unhurried. Something about it irritated Ben. Maybe it was the way Tony seemed completely unbothered by the world around him. Maybe it was how Donna had looked at him earlier, speaking to him like an equal rather than hired help. Or maybe, somewhere deep down in a place Ben refused to examine, he sensed that this unremarkable older man with his silver hair and patient eyes was about to unravel everything. Because here's what Ben Qualls didn't understand yet. Some people drive cars, some people drive lives. And some people, the really dangerous ones, drive truth straight into the heart of every comfortable lie you've ever told yourself. Tony finished polishing the passenger side mirror, his reflection briefly visible in its gleaming surface. He glanced up toward Ben's study window, and for just a moment, their eyes met across the distance. Tony smiled. And Ben felt his perfect morning shift just slightly off its axis, like a picture frame tilted 1 degree too far. Not enough to fall, not yet, but enough to notice, enough to make you wonder if maybe, just maybe, gravity was about to remember how it worked. Spoiler alert, it was. The Bloomberg interview aired on a Tuesday, and Ben watched it 3 times that morning alone. There he was, framed perfectly against the Qualls Holdings logo, his suit sharp enough to cut glass, his smile calibrated for maximum charisma. The interviewer leaned forward, clearly impressed, asking about the company's recent expansion into emerging markets, a strategic move that had industry analysts buzzing for weeks. It's about vision, Ben said on screen, his voice smooth with practiced authority. You have to see opportunities before they become obvious. That's what separates the leaders from the followers. What the camera didn't show was the 3-inch binder of research Donna's team had compiled over 6 months. It didn't capture the late-night strategy sessions she'd conducted with actual market analysts or the risk assessments she'd personally reviewed. The interviewer never asked whose signature appeared on the actual market entry documents or who'd negotiated the partnerships that made the expansion possible in the first place. They just pointed the camera at Ben's confident face and let him take credit for brilliance that had never originated in his head. Ben rewound to his favorite part, the moment where he leaned back, gestured broadly, and said, "Success isn't about working harder, it's about working smarter." The studio audience actually applauded. He'd posted the clip to LinkedIn twice already, watching the likes climb into the thousands. This was his kingdom, built on interviews and appearances, constructed from confident soundbites and borrowed wisdom, held together by the world's willingness to believe that the face of success must be its architect. And for years, that kingdom had felt unshakable. An empire of paper and perception, but an empire nonetheless. The thing about paper kingdoms, though they burn so easily once someone lights a match, that afternoon Ben had a keynote speech at the Regional Business Leaders Conference. He arrived 40 minutes late, because important men arrive when they choose to, and made his entrance with maximum impact. The audience turned, recognizing him from magazine covers and television appearances. He took the stage without notes, because he'd given this speech so many times he could deliver it in his sleep. The narrative never changed. Poor kid makes good, builds empire through grit and determination, shares wisdom with the next generation. My father used to tell me, Ben said, pacing the stage with rehearsed spontaneity, that wealth isn't just about money, it's about legacy. True statement. His father had said exactly that. What Ben conveniently omitted was that his father had also said it right before secretly transferring the family holdings to Donna, because he'd recognized in his son a dangerous combination of entitlement and recklessness. But that part didn't make for a compelling keynote. The audience ate it up. They always did. After the speech, business cards pressed into his palm, young entrepreneurs asking for his secrets, older executives nodding with respect. Ben stood at the center of it all, feeding off their admiration like oxygen, never once wondering why Donna hadn't come to watch him speak. She used to, back in the beginning, back when things were different between them. The memory surfaced unbidden. Donna at 26, sitting in a coffee shop near the university, laughing at something he'd said. She'd worn a simple blue dress that day, her natural beauty needing no enhancement, her intelligence evident in every word she spoke. Ben had been drawn to her immediately, but not for the reasons he should have been. He saw her grace and thought accessory. He noticed her family name and thought opportunity. When she talked about her father's business philosophy, about building something meaningful rather than just profitable, Ben had nodded along while mentally calculating his trajectory once he had access to that world. He'd been charming back then, attentive. He'd listened to her dreams about expanding her father's foundation work, about using wealth as a tool for genuine change. He'd held her hand during her father's funeral, whispering the right words, playing the supportive husband while her grief gave him the opening he'd been waiting for. The transition had been seamless, Ben Qualls stepping into a leadership role at Qualls Holdings, giving interviews about honoring her father's legacy while systematically taking credit for every success the company achieved. Donna had watched it happen, watched him transform from charming suitor to entitled executive, watched him mistake her silence for acceptance, her patience for weakness. She'd loved who she thought he was. The realization of who he actually was had come slowly, painfully, like watching something beautiful rot from the inside. But here's what Ben never understood about his wife. Donna didn't react. She calculated, she observed, she planned. And when she finally moved, it would be with the precision of someone who'd thought through every angle. Tony became her constant shadow that week. Ben noticed him everywhere, opening Donna's car door outside the foundation offices, carrying her briefcase into board meetings, standing discreetly in corners during conference calls. The man moved like smoke, present but not intrusive, seeing everything while appearing to see nothing. It should have been unremarkable. Drivers did these things. Assistants managed schedules. But something about Tony's presence kept catching Ben's attention, like a splinter he couldn't quite locate. At dinner Thursday night, one of the rare evenings when both Ben and Donna were home, the tension finally crystallized into words. The dining room gleamed with understated elegance, the table set with china that cost more per plate than most people earned in a week. Maria served the first course silently, her eyes carefully neutral as she placed plates before them. The foundation received the audit results today, Donna said, her voice even as she lifted her wine glass. She didn't look at Ben directly, studying the Cabernet instead. Some interesting findings about discretionary spending. Ben barely glanced up from his phone, scrolling through social media responses to his conference appearance. "That's great, honey. Foundation stuff. Your department." "Actually," Donna continued, still not looking at him, "it's your spending that's flagged. The corporate card charges, entertainment expenses. That European trip last month, you classified as business development." Now Ben looked up, irritation flickering across his face. "Those were legitimate business expenses. I was building relationships, expanding our network. That's how this works, Donna. You can't penny pinch success." $50,000 in a single weekend, she said quietly, finally meeting his eyes. "For a conference you didn't attend and meetings that never happened. "I explained this already," Ben said, his voice taking on that edge of condescension he used when he wanted to end conversations. "Sometimes business happens off the books. You wouldn't understand the nuances of deal-making." Donna's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, not anger exactly, more like confirmation. Like she'd just verified a calculation she already knew was correct. "The spending is testing the company's stability. We need to discuss establishing better controls." Ben laughed, sharp and dismissive. "Controls? Donna, I've grown this company beyond anything your father imagined. A little spending comes with the territory. Maybe focus on your charity work and let me handle the real business." The silence that followed was weighted with meaning. Ben was too self-absorbed to interpret. Donna simply nodded once, a gesture Tony witnessed from his position by the hallway entrance. The older man's face remained perfectly neutral, but his eyes tracked every micro-expression, every unspoken tension vibrating across the dinner table. Ben returned to his phone, the conversation already forgotten in his mind. Another annoyance managed, another attempted intrusion into his authority deflected. He didn't see Donna glance toward Tony, didn't catch the subtle nod between them. The communication happened in the language of patience and preparation, a dialect Ben had never bothered to learn. The real fracture came Friday evening. Ben was hosting a small gathering. Small, meaning 40 people filling the ground floor, networking and drinking wine that cost more per bottle than most of them spent on groceries monthly. He was in his element, moving between clusters of guests, telling the same stories that always landed, basking in admiration that felt like validation. Marcus, one of the household staff, made the mistake of refilling a guest's glass too slowly. Ben noticed from across the room and cut through the crowd with purpose. "What the hell are you doing?" Ben's voice carried, sharp enough to slice through the background conversation. Several guests turned, suddenly uncomfortable. "I don't pay you to move like you're underwater. Get it together or get out." Marcus stammered an apology, his dark skin flushing with humiliation. He was 19, working nights to pay for community college, and this job meant everything to his family's stability. But Ben didn't know that, didn't care to know that. All he saw was someone moving too slowly in his house, disrupting his perfect evening. "This is my house," Ben continued, his voice rising. "My rules. You want to work here? You move when I say move. You understand me?" Tony materialized from nowhere, smoothly intercepting Marcus with a subtle gesture. "Allow me, sir," he said quietly, taking the wine bottle and guiding the shaking young man toward the kitchen. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but his eyes, when they briefly met Ben's, held something else entirely: judgment, perhaps, or disappointment, or simply recognition of exactly who Ben Qualls really was. Ben watched them go, irritation still simmering. He turned back to his guests with a practiced smile, a joke already forming about finding good help these days, but several people had turned away, suddenly interested in other conversations. The moment had soured something, but Ben shook it off. What did they know about running an estate, managing staff, maintaining standards? What Ben didn't see was Tony in the kitchen, quietly telling Marcus to take the rest of the night off with full pay. He didn't see Donna standing at the top of the stairs, having witnessed the entire exchange, her expression unreadable but final, like a door closing on something that could never be reopened. Later that night, well past midnight, when the estate had finally quieted, Tony sat in his modest quarters reviewing the day's observations. His phone buzzed. Donna's lawyer, right on schedule. "It's time," the lawyer's voice said simply. Tony looked at the folder on his desk, thick with documentation, photographs, recorded conversations, a complete portrait of every test Ben Qualls had failed without ever knowing he was being evaluated. "The tests have begun?" the lawyer asked. "No," Tony replied, his voice quiet but certain. "The tests are over. He failed every single one. Now we just show him the score." He ended the call and sat in the darkness, thinking about men like Ben, so convinced of their own importance that they never noticed the ground crumbling beneath their expensive shoes. Tomorrow would bring the first envelope, the first crack in the illusion, the beginning of the end of everything Ben thought he'd built. But tonight, Ben Qualls slept peacefully in his king-size bed, in his climate-controlled bedroom, in his marble-floored mansion, still believing every inch of it proved his worth. Still believing the kingdom was his. Still believing paper couldn't burn. Tony Castellano had learned patience in boardrooms where millions hung on silence, had mastered observation in the shadowy corners of power where the real decisions got made. 27 years working beside Malcolm Qualls, Donna's father, had taught him that truth revealed itself not in what people said, but in what they did when they thought no one important was watching. And right now, driving Ben Qualls to another pointless lunch meeting, Tony was watching everything. The black Mercedes sedan glided through Virginia traffic, its leather interior smelling of expensive cologne and entitlement. Ben sat in the back, phone pressed to his ear, talking loudly about acquisition strategies he didn't understand to someone who probably wasn't listening. Tony's eyes stayed on the road, but his mind cataloged every word, every inflection, every reveal of character that Ben delivered without realizing he was confessing. No, tell Davidson I want controlling interest or we walk. Ben barked into the phone. I don't care what their lawyers say, this is my deal, my vision. They either get on board or get left behind. Except it wasn't his deal. Tony had seen the actual documents 2 days ago. Donna's acquisition team had been negotiating for 3 months, building relationships, conducting due diligence, structuring terms that protected everyone involved. Ben had been copied on exactly 2 emails about it, neither of which he'd read past the subject line. But here he was, taking ownership with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged, never been told that credit and contribution weren't the same thing. Tony adjusted the rearview mirror fractionally, catching Ben's reflection. The younger man had loosened his tie, his face flushed with the adrenaline of imaginary authority. He looked so much like his father in those moments, the same sharp jawline, the same practiced charm. But Malcolm Qualls had possessed something his son fundamentally lacked, the ability to see beyond his own reflection. Tony remembered the day Malcolm had called him into his office, 3 years before the cancer took him. The older man had looked diminished already, the disease eating away at someone who'd built empires through force of will and strategic brilliance. But his mind remained sharp, cutting through sentiment to see the hard truths his family couldn't face. Benjamin won't change, Malcolm had said, his voice already thready with exhaustion. I've watched him, waited for growth, given him opportunities to prove himself. But he sees people as props, Tony. Props in his personal theater of success. Tony had wanted to argue, to defend the young man who'd charmed his way into Malcolm's daughter's heart. But he'd seen it too, the way Ben's eyes glazed over when Donna spoke about her foundation work, the casual cruelty towards staff, the inability to celebrate anyone's success but his own. Donna deserves better, Malcolm continued. But she loves him, or loves who she thinks he could become, so we protect her differently. We let him think he has power while we build walls around what actually matters. That conversation had led to the restructuring, the quiet transfer of holdings, the creation of the Qualls Trust with provisions that would activate upon Malcolm's death. Tony had become executor, guardian of a legacy Malcolm feared his son-in-law would destroy through incompetence or ego or both. And when Donna finally called him 6 months ago, her voice tired but determined, Tony had known exactly what she needed him to do. I need to see it clearly, she'd said. Without my hope getting in the way. Without love blurring the edges, can you do that? So Tony had traded his suits for a driver's uniform, had stepped back into the shadows where truth lived, and began documenting exactly who Ben Qualls was when he thought the help wasn't paying attention. The Mercedes approached an intersection where construction had narrowed the lanes. Ben was still on his phone, oblivious. Tony knew the route, knew the blind spots, knew how delivery trucks used the right lane to make sudden left turns across traffic. He'd driven these streets for Malcolm 100 times, knew every dangerous quirk. Sir, Tony said quietly, preparing to take the safer left route that added 90 seconds. Construction ahead. I'll take Riverside to avoid. No, Ben interrupted without looking up. Straight through. I'm not sitting in traffic because you're afraid of a little construction. It's not about traffic, sir. The sight lines are compromised. Last week there was... Did I ask for a geography lesson? Ben's voice sharpened with irritation. I said straight through, "You're the driver. I'm the one who actually matters here. Just drive." Tony's hands tightened fractionally on the steering wheel, then relaxed. He'd learned long ago that arguing with men like Ben only reinforced their sense of authority. So he continued straight, but slowed the vehicle carefully, positioned it defensively, kept his eyes tracking every angle. When a panel van did exactly what Tony predicted, swerving suddenly left from the right lane without signaling, he was already braking, already steering them safely past the near collision. Ben never looked up from his phone, never noticed how close they'd come to a crash that would have made headlines, never acknowledged that Tony's experience had just saved his oblivious life. He just kept talking, kept performing importance for an audience of one. Tony filed it away. Week 1, Observation 17. Subject places personal convenience above safety. Dismisses expertise when it contradicts immediate desires. Lacks situational awareness beyond his own priorities. The lunch meeting was predictable. Tony waited in the parking lot, but not idly. He'd learned to use these hours productively. His tablet connected to secure servers, pulling up the documentation he'd been assembling. Photographs of Ben at various events, timestamps on corporate card purchases, recordings of conversations where Ben took credit for work others had completed. It was meticulous, comprehensive, the kind of documentation that would survive any legal challenge. Because let me break it down for you, Tony wasn't just observing, he was building a case, not for court necessarily, though it could end up there. More importantly, he was constructing an irrefutable mirror that would force Ben to see himself as others saw him. Some people needed gentle guidance to grow. Others needed their illusions systematically demolished before reality could penetrate. Ben Qualls was definitely in the second category. Tony's phone buzzed with a message from Donna. "Foundation board meeting at 3. He'll want to attend. Let him." Tony understood immediately. The foundation, Malcolm's true legacy, the charitable organization that actually changed lives, was holding its quarterly review. Ben usually ignored these meetings, considering charity work beneath his attention. But if Donna was inviting his presence, she had a reason. She always did. They arrived at the foundation offices 20 minutes early. The building was modest compared to Qualls Holdings headquarters. No marble lobby, no expensive art, just clean lines and purposeful spaces designed for function over flash. Ben walked through like a tourist in a foreign country, vaguely distasteful, clearly feeling this environment was beneath someone of his stature. Tony held doors, carried Ben's briefcase, positioned himself in the back of the conference room where he could observe without being observed. The board members filtered in serious people who'd spent decades in nonprofit work, who measured success and lives improved rather than profits maximized. Donna sat at the head of the table, somehow commanding respect without demanding it, the way her father had. Ben took a seat beside her, immediately checking his phone, half listening as the presentations began. Numbers scrolled across screens, children fed, families housed, students educated. Real impact, quantified and verified. The kind of work that required patience and persistence and genuine commitment to something beyond personal gain. "We're considering the scholarship expansion," Donna said, gesturing to financial projections. "It would mean reallocating some discretionary funds, but the potential impact is significant." One board member raised concerns about sustainability. Another asked about implementation timelines. The discussion was thoughtful, collaborative, everyone contributing expertise while checking their egos at the door. It was how functional organizations operated when status took a backseat to mission. Then Ben spoke. "Here's what I think," he said, not waiting for an opening in the conversation. "You're thinking too small. Scholarships are fine, but they don't scale. What you need is a high-profile gala, something that gets attention, gets my face, our faces, in front of major donors. That's how you raise real money." The room went quiet. Donna's expression remained neutral, but Tony saw her fingers tighten fractionally around her pen. "The scholarship program serves 200 students directly," one board member said carefully. "That's quite significant scale. But it's not sexy," Ben countered. "Nobody writes checks for steady, boring success. They write checks for vision, for excitement. Trust me, I know how these people think." What Ben didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn, was that 3 of the board members were themselves scholarship recipients from earlier iterations of the program. They'd gone on to become doctors, educators, nonprofit leaders. The boring success he dismissed had literally created the accomplished people sitting across from him. But he'd never asked about their backgrounds, never seen them as anything but obstacles to his superior vision. Donna smoothly redirected the conversation, thanking Ben for his input while guiding discussion back to the actual agenda. Tony watched it happen, watched her manage her husband's ego while protecting the work that mattered, watched her perform the exhausting dance of keeping his destructiveness contained while building something meaningful around him. How long had she been doing this, Tony wondered? How many meetings, how many moments, how many small humiliations had she absorbed to keep Ben's damage limited? After the meeting, Tony drove them back to the estate in silence. Ben was already on his phone again, texting someone about his breakthrough ideas for the foundation. Tony watched him through the mirror. This man-child who'd been handed everything and earned nothing, who confused volume with authority and presence with contribution. Back at the estate, Tony went through his evening routine. He parked the Mercedes in the garage, but instead of immediately going to his quarters, he stayed with the vehicle. He retrieved his polishing cloths, his specialized cleaners, and began the meditative work of maintaining the car's finish. Some drivers saw this as tedious labor. Tony saw it as philosophy made manifest. Every circular motion removed another layer of road grime, revealed another inch of the car's true surface. You couldn't rush it, you couldn't fake it. You had to work methodically, patiently, trusting that sustained effort would eventually reveal what had always been underneath. He worked on the driver's side mirror first, polishing until his own reflection emerged with perfect clarity. 58 years old, silver hair, lines around his eyes from decades of careful observation. He looked like a driver, dressed like a driver. But anyone who looked closer would see the intelligence in those eyes, the education in how he carried himself, the authority he deliberately cloaked in service. Tony moved to the passenger mirror, thinking about Ben seeing his own reflection every time he got in the car, never recognizing that he was looking at a carefully constructed performance rather than truth. The mirror showed you exactly what was there, no flattery, no interpretation, just reality. But most people had spent so long curating their self-image that they couldn't see their actual reflection anymore. That's what Tony was doing now, polishing mirrors, preparing to show Ben Qualls an image of himself so clear, so undeniable, that even his practiced delusions couldn't survive contact with it. His phone buzzed, Donna requesting he bring the week 1 folder to her study. Tony gathered the documentation, a thin manila folder that contained everything he'd observed and recorded over the past 7 days. It looked insignificant, barely a quarter-inch thick, but inside was a complete psychological profile built from small moments and revealing behaviors. The way Ben treated service staff, how he responded to gentle correction, his inability to credit others or acknowledge expertise beyond his own. He found Donna in her study, the room that had once been her father's sanctuary. Bookshelves lined every wall, filled with volumes on economics, philosophy, nonprofit management. Malcolm's presence still lingered here in the worn leather chair, the antique desk lamp, the framed photograph of him with a young Donna, both of them laughing at something the camera hadn't captured. Week 1, Tony said simply, placing the folder before her. Donna opened it slowly, her trained eyes moving across each page with the same analytical precision her father had possessed. Tony watched her process the information, 17 separate observations, each documented with notes and supporting evidence. Her face remained impassive, but he saw the subtle tightening around her eyes when she reached observation 12, subject publicly humiliated junior staff member at social gathering. Zero awareness of impact. She read through everything twice before closing the folder. When she looked up at Tony, her eyes held a weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "Keep watching," she said quietly, picking up a pen and signing her initials at the bottom of the summary page. "He's not ready yet." "Ready for what?" Tony asked, though he already knew the answer. "To see himself," Donna replied, "to actually look in the mirror instead of at his reflection." Tony understood the distinction. A reflection could be posed, managed, curated, but really seeing yourself, seeing the impact you had on others, the truth of your character, the gap between who you thought you were and who you actually were, that required a different kind of looking, the kind that hurt before it healed. "How many more weeks?" he asked. "As many as it takes," Donna said. "My father spent 3 years documenting my mother's decline before he finally intervened. Sometimes love makes us patient beyond reason, but eventually—" She paused, looking toward Malcolm's photograph. "Eventually patience becomes enabling, and I won't enable him into destroying everything my father built." Tony nodded. He'd been there for that situation too, Malcolm's first wife, whose gambling addiction had nearly bankrupted them before Malcolm finally acted. The man had believed in second chances, in rehabilitation, in the power of love to transform people, but he'd also understood that transformation required the person to want to change, and wanting to change required first admitting something was wrong. Ben Qualls had never admitted anything was wrong in his entire life. The next evening, Ben announced he was hosting a fundraiser for the Arts Council, a last-minute decision motivated entirely by seeing a rival businessman's name in the society pages. 200 people, full catering, live music, the kind of event that cost more to produce than it raised for charity. But it would get his name in the papers, his face in photographs, his importance validated by attendance numbers. Tony watched the preparations unfold. Watched Ben throw money around like a man who'd earned it, who had the right to spend it, who understood where it came from. Watched him sign checks that pulled from corporate accounts, not personal ones. Watched him structure the entire event as a business expense that would be justified through the vaguest possible connection to client development. And Tony documented everything, discreetly photographed every invoice, recorded every conversation where Ben gave financial instructions, tracked every dollar that flowed from company coffers toward personal aggrandizement disguised as professional necessity. The fundraiser itself was predictably extravagant. Ben held court at the center of it all, drink in hand, telling stories about his charitable philosophy to people who would forget them by morning. Tony moved through the crowd like a ghost, refilling glasses, clearing tables, seeing everything while appearing to see nothing. Near midnight, as the last guests departed and cleanup crews began their work, Tony found himself alone in the garage again, sitting in the driver's seat of the Mercedes. He opened his tablet and added the final notes to Week 2's observations. The folder was thicker now, more damning, a complete portrait of a man who'd confused performance with substance for so long he'd forgotten there was supposed to be a difference. Tomorrow he'd deliver this folder to Donna. She'd read it with that same analytical precision, that same deepening sadness. And she'd tell him the same thing: keep watching, he's not ready yet. But Tony wondered how much more watching she could endure, how many more weeks of documentation before the weight of evidence finally outweighed her hope. How many more mirrors would he need to polish before they showed an image so clear that even Ben Qualls couldn't look away? Because here's what Tony knew from 27 years in the shadows of power: everyone eventually sees themselves truly. The only question is whether that seeing happens soon enough to matter or too late to change anything at all. He looked at his own reflection in the rearview mirror one more time. The driver, the observer, the patient architect of unavoidable truth. Some people drove cars. Tony Castellano was driving something far more dangerous, the slow, methodical exposure of a man who'd spent his entire life running from honest mirrors. And spoiler alert, you can only run so far before the reflection catches up. The Anderson Charity Gala was the kind of event where power came dressed in black tie and wrote checks between champagne refills. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across the ballroom of the Riverside Hotel, illuminating faces that appeared regularly in Forbes and Fortune. String quartets played something classical and forgettable while servers circulated with hors d'oeuvres that cost more per bite than most people spent on entire meals. This was Ben's natural habitat, a room full of people impressed by wealth, where perception mattered more than substance, where he could perform success for an audience that rarely looked beneath the surface. Ben worked the room with practiced ease, his tuxedo custom-tailored to emphasize his athletic build, his smile calibrated for maximum charm. He was mid-conversation with a tech CEO, gesturing expansively about market disruption and paradigm shifts, when he noticed Donna on the mezzanine balcony above. She stood alone, backlit by soft amber lighting, wearing a midnight blue gown that made her look like she'd stepped out of a different era, elegant, untouchable, observing the crowd below with an expression that gave away nothing. Their eyes met across the distance. She didn't smile, didn't nod. Just looked at him with that same evaluating gaze she'd been giving him for months now, like she was watching an experiment unfold and recording the results. Something uncomfortable twisted in Ben's chest, but he pushed it away. She was probably just tired. The foundation work exhausted her sometimes, all those endless meetings about budgets and impact assessments. He turned back to his conversation, already forgetting the moment. That's when he saw Tony approaching through the crowd. The older man moved with purpose, carrying something, a manila envelope, letter-sized, sealed. People parted unconsciously as he passed, responding to something in his bearing that suggested he belonged here despite the chauffeur's uniform. Ben felt irritation spike immediately. What was Tony doing interrupting him during an important networking opportunity? The help was supposed to remain invisible at events like this. "Mr. Qualls," Tony said quietly, stopping at a respectful distance. His voice was pitched low enough not to carry, but firm enough to demand attention. "Mrs. Qualls asked that you review this before the evening concludes." Ben glanced at the envelope, then at Tony, then toward the balcony where Donna still stood watching. "Can't this wait? I'm in the middle of something." "I'm afraid it cannot, sir." Something in Tony's tone suggested this wasn't a request. She was quite specific about the timing. The tech CEO Ben had been talking to made polite noises about refreshing his drink and drifted away, leaving Ben alone with Tony and the envelope that suddenly felt like it weighed more than paper should. Around them, the gala continued its choreographed dance of wealth and influence, but Ben felt a subtle shift in attention. A few people had noticed the interaction, were watching with the casual curiosity of those who sensed drama brewing. Ben snatched the envelope, his jaw tight with barely suppressed anger. "Fine. Thank you, Tony. You can go now." But Tony didn't move. He simply stood there, hands clasped behind his back, waiting with the patience of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen and had no intention of missing it. Ben broke the seal, irritation making his movements sharp. Inside were several pages of legal documentation, the kind of dense text that usually made his eyes glaze over, but certain phrases jumped out immediately, each one landing like a physical blow. Qualls Holdings, LLC, registered proprietor, Donna A. Qualls. Articles of incorporation filed March 2019, sole shareholder of record. Amendment to corporate structure. Transfer of all holdings effective. Ben's hands started shaking. He read the same lines 3 times, 4 times, his brain refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. This had to be a mistake, some clerical error. The company bore his name, Qualls. He gave the interviews, signed the documents, made the decisions. How could Donna's name be on? "What is this?" His voice came out hoarse, barely controlled. "Those are the corporate registration documents for Qualls Holdings," Tony said calmly, "as well as the property deeds for this estate, the subsidiary holdings, and the investment portfolios. All filed with the state and county, all bearing Mrs. Qualls's name as sole proprietor." Ben looked up at the balcony. Donna was still there, still watching, her expression carved from stone. She knew. Of course she knew. She'd sent these documents with Tony, had orchestrated this moment, this public exposure of what? His ignorance? His assumption? His complete failure to ever ask the basic question of whose name appeared on the legal paperwork. "This is bullshit," Ben hissed, loud enough that several nearby guests turned their heads. "These documents, they're wrong. Doctored. Some kind of—" "They're authentic, sir," Tony interrupted quietly. "Filed with the State Corporation Commission. Notarized. Audited annually. If you'd like, I can provide you with the case numbers and public record access information. Anyone can verify them." Ben's face flushed red. Around them, more people were noticing now, sensing blood in the water, the trained and authoritative. Thank you for attending what we've been calling the Qualls Foundation's annual announcement, but that's not entirely accurate. Ben's heart hammered. This wasn't the script. This wasn't what they'd discussed. He glanced at Donna, but she remained motionless, watching Tony with the same steady focus. What you're about to witness, Tony continued, is the formal legal transfer and restructuring of the Qualls family holdings, a process that has been 3 years in the making, since the death of Malcolm Qualls. Ben felt the ground shift beneath his expensive shoes. The cameras swiveled back toward him, reporters' expressions sharpening with the scent of real news, actual drama, the kind of story that led broadcasts and trended on social media. Tony descended from the platform, walking directly to Ben. He held out the thick envelope with both hands, a gesture that felt ceremonial, final. "Mr. Qualls," Tony said, his voice quieter now but still audible to the surrounding microphones, "this document finalizes the Qualls family trust. It officially transfers all holdings, properties, and assets under the singular control of Mrs. Donna A. Qualls, with provisions for charitable disbursement as outlined by Malcolm Qualls's original vision." Ben took the envelope with numb fingers. Around them, reporters were already typing, speaking into cameras, narrating the moment for their audiences. He could hear fragments. "Stunning revelation. Public transfer of wealth. Husband apparently unaware." "Open it," Donna's voice cut through the noise. She'd moved closer, standing just a few feet away now. "Read page 7. Ben's hands shook as he broke the seal. The document was dense with legalese, but certain phrases jumped out with brutal clarity. "Benjamin Qualls shall retain no ownership stake. Ceremonial signature without legal authority. Advisory role contingent upon demonstrated character. Growth." Page 7 was worse. It was a letter from Malcolm, dated a week before his death, laying out exactly why he'd structured things this way. Clinical analysis of Ben's character flaws. Documentation of financial irresponsibility. Projections of the damage Ben could cause if given actual control. And the final paragraph, the one that made cameras flash in Ben's peripheral vision as tears formed in his eyes. "Benjamin, if you're reading this, it means you've been living a lie for years. My hope is that discovering the truth breaks you enough to rebuild yourself into someone worth Donna's love. You were never the heir to this legacy. You were the lesson both for yourself and for anyone who thinks wealth without character means anything at all." Tony's voice cut through Ben's shock. "You were never the heir, Mr. Qualls. You were the lesson." The words echoed across the driveway, bouncing off marble and glass, and the collective held breath of 40 journalists recording every second. Camera flashes exploded like lightning, capturing Ben's face, the shock, the pain, the public death of every illusion he'd ever constructed about himself. This was it. The final humiliation. The ultimate exposure. Everything he'd feared for months, happening exactly as dramatically as his nightmares had predicted. Except something was different now than it would have been 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, Ben would have raged, would have denied, attacked, blamed everyone except himself, would have created a scene that would have defined him forever as the entitled man-child, who couldn't face reality even when it was documented in legal filings and witnessed by media representatives. But 6 weeks of 5:30 a.m. wake-ups had changed something. 6 weeks of learning staff members' names and actually listening when they spoke. 6 weeks of Tony's quiet mentorship, Malcolm's posthumous wisdom, and the slow, painful work of looking at himself clearly for the first time in his adult life. Ben looked at the document, then at Tony, then at Donna, whose eyes held something he couldn't quite read, not cruelty but not comfort either. Just that same steady evaluation, waiting to see who he'd choose to be in this moment. He could feel the expectations, the reporters waiting for the meltdown, the cameras ready to capture the rage. Even some part of his old self, that performative ego, screaming at him to fight, to defend, to do anything except accept this public destruction. Instead, Ben did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He laughed. Not bitter, broken laughter like in the elevator weeks ago. Something different, lighter, the kind of laugh that comes when you finally stop pretending and the relief of truth outweighs the pain of exposure. "You know what?" Ben said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent crowd. "Thank you." The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Reporters glanced at each other, confused. Donna's eyes widened fractionally, the first break in her composure Ben had seen all morning. Even Tony looked surprised, though he recovered quickly. "Thank you," Ben repeated, louder now, addressing not just Tony but Donna, the cameras, the universe itself. "For 3 years, I've been walking around thinking I was someone I wasn't, living in a house I didn't own, spending money I didn't earn, taking credit for work I didn't do, and everyone let me. Everyone played along with my delusion." He held up the document, the papers fluttering slightly in the morning breeze. This is the most honest thing anyone's given me in a decade. No flattery, no performance, just truth. Documented, witnessed, irrefutable truth about exactly who I've been. Ben stepped toward Donna, and for a moment, the entire driveway held its breath. He handed her the document ceremonially, deliberately, making it clear to every camera that he understood exactly what he was giving back. "I was never the heir," he said quietly, repeating Tony's words but with different meaning now. "I was the lesson, the cautionary tale about what happens when ego substitutes for character, when performance replaces substance, when you're so busy looking at your reflection that you forget to see yourself." Donna's carefully constructed composure finally cracked. Her eyes filled not with tears exactly, but with something that looked like cautious hope mixed with disbelief. "But here's the thing about lessons," Ben continued, his voice steadying. "They're only valuable if someone learns from them, and I'm finally starting to learn." He turned toward the cameras, toward the reporters who'd come expecting spectacle and were getting something more complicated instead. "You want a story? Here it is. I've been a fraud. An entitled, arrogant fraud who confused luck with skill and access with achievement. Everything I thought I built was actually built by my wife, her father, and people I treated like scenery in my personal success story." The admission hung in the morning air, raw and complete. Ben felt something break inside his chest, but not the way things had been breaking for weeks. This felt different, like shedding skin that had grown too tight, like finally exhaling after holding your breath for years. "Malcolm Qualls was right," Ben said, looking at Tony now. "I needed to be broken before I could be rebuilt, needed to have every illusion stripped away before I could see what was actually real. And you," he gestured between Tony and Donna, "you gave me that gift, even though it hurt, even though it meant watching me make a fool of myself repeatedly." Donna stepped forward, closing the distance between them. For the first time in months, she looked at Ben without that evaluating gaze. Just looked at him, really looked. "Ben," she started, but he shook his head. "I don't deserve forgiveness yet," he said quietly, meant for her ears but picked up by microphones anyway. "I don't even deserve a second chance, but I'm asking for the opportunity to earn one, not by going back to who I was, that guy's dead, and good riddance, but by becoming someone who might actually be worthy of the name Qualls." The driveway was silent except for camera shutters and the soft rustle of papers as reporters frantically took notes. This wasn't the scandal they'd expected. It was something more uncomfortable, a man actually taking responsibility, actually changing, actually growing in real time. Donna's hand found Ben's, a gesture so small but so significant that several cameras zoomed in to capture it. "That's all I ever wanted," she said quietly. "Not the performance, not the pretending, just the willingness to see yourself clearly and do the work to become better." Tony stepped back, giving them space, but Ben caught his eye. The older man nodded, once approval, recognition, or maybe just acknowledgement that the student had finally understood the lesson. The press conference continued, but the story had already been written. Not the scandal they'd anticipated, but something stranger and more compelling. A public humiliation that became a public awakening. A man losing everything and, in the process, finding the only thing that actually mattered: honesty about who he'd been and who he needed to become. As the crowd eventually dispersed and the cameras packed up, Ben stood in the driveway of an estate he'd never owned, beside a wife he'd never deserved, having just admitted to the world that he was everything he'd spent years pretending he wasn't, and for the first time in his entire life, he felt free. 3 months later, Ben Qualls stood in a community center in Arlington, reviewing business plans with 6 young entrepreneurs who'd never had access to capital or connections. No cameras, no press releases, just real work, the kind that left you exhausted but fulfilled in ways champagne galas never could. "Your market analysis is solid," Ben said, pointing to a projection on one applicant's laptop. "But you're underestimating operational costs. Trust me, I've made that mistake. Let's walk through it together." The young woman Maria, a single mother with a catering business dream, nodded eagerly, taking notes. Ben remembered dismissing people like her as background noise in his old life. Now he saw what he'd been missing: intelligence, determination, potential that just needed guidance instead of condescension. Tony observed from the back of the room, arms crossed, that familiar patient expression on his face, but something had shifted between them. The mentor-student dynamic remained, but respect flowed both directions now. Ben had earned it through 5:30 a.m. wake-ups, through actual learning, through 3 months of showing up consistently when nobody was watching to applaud. Donna appeared in the doorway, and Ben's heart still caught. Some things hadn't changed. She remained the most compelling person in any room she entered, but now he saw her clearly. Not as accessory or opportunity, but as the architect of everything meaningful in his life, including his own reconstruction. She caught his eye, smiled slightly, and mouthed, "Proud of you." Those 3 words meant more than any standing ovation he'd received in his previous life. The media narrative had shifted too. Headlines that once screamed scandal now told a different story. From humiliation to humility, Ben Qualls' remarkable transformation. Fallon executive finds purpose in service. The Qualls Foundation's quiet revolution. Ben had stopped reading them mostly. The external validation that once fed his ego now felt hollow compared to the quiet satisfaction of watching Maria's catering business actually launch, of seeing scholarship recipients succeed, of building something that would outlast his name. One Saturday morning, Ben actually drove, having finally earned back that basic privilege to Tony's home. Not the estate's guest house, but Tony's actual residence, a modest townhouse in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place that spoke of comfort earned through decades of actual work. Tony answered the door in jeans and a Georgetown sweatshirt, looking more relaxed than Ben had ever seen him. "Mr. Qualls," Tony said with practiced formality, though his eyes held warmth now. "Ben," he corrected for the 100th time. Just Ben. Inside, surrounded by books and photographs documenting Tony's actual life, his friendship with Malcolm, his own business ventures, evidence of a full existence, Ben had never bothered to notice. Ben handed over an envelope. "My turn," he said simply. Tony opened it, reading the handwritten letter inside. Ben had labored over every word, trying to capture gratitude that felt almost impossible to articulate. "You didn't just drive for her, you steered me back to myself. Thank you for seeing potential in someone who deserved nothing but contempt. Thank you for the patience to watch me fail until I finally learned how to grow. You gave me the greatest gift anyone can give another person, the truth, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt." Tony's eyes shimmered slightly as he folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket. "Malcolm would be proud," he said quietly. "Hell, I'm proud." The moment felt too significant for words, so they sat in comfortable silence, 2 men who'd traveled from opposite ends of a hierarchy to something that looked like genuine friendship. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Qualls Center for Ethical Leadership drew modest but meaningful attendance. Local business leaders, foundation board members, scholarship recipients whose lives had been changed by the program. No celebrity appearances, no media circus. Just people who understood that real legacy was built in moments like these. Donna stood at the podium, sunlight catching her face, Ben beside her as co-founder rather than figurehead. She spoke with the same measured authority she'd always possessed, but now Ben actually listened to every word. "My father used to say that wealth was easy to inherit," Donna said, her voice carrying across the small crowd. "Wisdom was harder, character was hardest of all. This center exists to teach what money can't buy: integrity, humility, the courage to fail honestly rather than succeed falsely." She turned toward Ben, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, they'd moved past needing that transaction. Something deeper, partnership, respect, love rebuilt on honest foundations. Some inherit fortunes, Donna concluded, her eyes holding Ben's. Others inherit wisdom. Only the wise know which lasts longer. Applause filled the courtyard as they cut the ribbon together, their hands overlapping on the ceremonial scissors. The Qualls Center opened its doors not to Ben's ego, but to his contribution. Real contribution, earned through transformation. The black Mercedes pulled away from the mansion that evening, Tony driving as always, Ben in the passenger seat. But everything was different now. The silence between them was comfortable. The hierarchy had dissolved into mutual respect. Ben looked out the window at the estate. Donna's estate always had been, and felt none of the shame that used to choke him. "Where to, Ben?" Tony asked, the first-name basis finally feeling natural. "Wherever you think I need to go," Ben replied with a slight smile. "You haven't steered me wrong yet." The car disappeared down the tree-lined drive, carrying two men who'd learned that the real inheritance wasn't money or property or status. It was the wisdom to know yourself honestly, the humility to accept correction, and the courage to rebuild when everything you thought you were turned out to be an illusion. Some lessons required humiliation, others required patience, the best ones required both. And Ben Qualls, finally, truthfully, had learned them all. If this story hit you in the chest, you need to watch these next two, on your screen right now, and don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button. See you in the next story.